Hello. Um, I want to talk to you in this presentation a little bit about how to design a lesson plan, a direct interactive instruction approach to teaching. So I'm going to share the screen and take you to the presentation. My title page here says fully guided instruction. One of the characteristics of a properly written, properly designed, direct interactive instruction approach is what we call fully guided instruction. In this approach, you literally are guiding the students to the learning, gradually releasing them to being able to understand the content in an independent way, with very structured, lots of steps, though lots of flexibility for teacher decision making and use of good questions and that sort of thing. So you recently saw my demo lesson on how to write objectives. That was done using the direct instruction approach. So in this presentation, I call this Unpacking the Lesson Plan, and this should be a nice scaffold for you to understand a little bit more about how to develop a lesson plan, how to write a lesson plan to be able to deliver it to students. So the first part of the presentation, I'm going to do a very brief research synopsis. I'm going to show you what some of the research says about this. This goes with some of the readings that we provided in the Canvas for you to understand some background, foundational kinds of things about why we want to use this approach, or at least be good at this approach, in addition to many others that you're going to get. As you go through our three-phase program, you will be seeing lots of other models throughout, inquiry and other types of approaches as well that have to do with creativity and other models. So in a brief research synopsis, then I'm going to get into designing the lesson plan, what the components are, and what they look like. First of all, in terms of the teacher effectiveness research that has come out over the years, the two bullets here: time allocated for a specific academic task was strongly related to academic achievement. It makes sense. Direct instruction has lots of high engagement rates because you're really focused on the academic task at hand. And when you spend, the more time you spend on anything, the better you're going to get at it, especially if the instruction is quality. An example of this is if you're learning to ride a bike and you've only ridden for 3 hours, and then your friend has ridden for 1,000 hours, who's more likely to be a better bike rider? Your friend. It's not a mystery that time on task will really achieve that for you. And learning is no different. In Richard Clark's article, the professor from the USC psychology professor, one of the readings that I had you do was putting students on the path to learning. He makes a case for fully guided instruction. There was lots of information in that article, obviously, but some of the key points that he made were that one of the key ones is that for everyone but experts, partial guidance during instruction is less effective, significantly less effective than full guidance. Children that do not have an extensive storage of long-term memory information in there have a more difficult time in other models where they're having to discover their knowledge. It takes an expert teacher to do inquiry well. Most of these models work only as good as the individuals who are using them. You can use and misuse any model. So it has to be done well. What he also found was that novice learners gain more from fully guided teaching. Expert learners gain more from unguided approaches, which is pretty interesting, and it kind of makes sense, right? If you're an expert learner, you have a lot of prior knowledge, you have a lot of information that you could go to try to uncover more information. And so his research showed that, major findings. John Hattie is another person who's made a big impact and is very well read and is prominent in our field. He's really looking at what we call high impact strategies, high leverage practices for teachers through his program called Visible Learning. What's impressive about his work is that he looked at, thousands of studies. He synthesized over 50,000 studies. He did 800 meta-analysis, which is looking at these groups of studies. And what he found was that all interventions work. Everything you do with students is going to work, but some are more effective. And you have to, and so he rank ordered them according to effect size. He really scientized this idea that there are certain things that we should be doing with students that have higher impact on their learning, and based on lots of studies that he did. Just a few things, a little snapshot of some of his work. What should teachers do? And it's interesting to me that, look at one of the top things that you could do as a teacher, being passionate. How do you put that in the lesson plan? It's more of an attitude. It's not an easy thing to teach. It's an intangible. Many times the intangible things that we do are the things that impact learning the most, and being passionate is one of them. Monitoring impact, checking for understanding, the formative assessments that we use is also at the very top. So we constantly have to look at where kids are at, taking their pulse to see that they're learning and understanding what you're teaching. Another one that seems so simple that it's like, yeah, well, I know that, is teacher clarity. We kind of take it for granted, but are we really clear about our goals and where we're taking kids to in terms of learning? It's like that Alice in Wonderland story in the demo lesson I did for you. If you want to take them somewhere, you have to be clear about where you want to take the students in their learning. Now, another one of my favorites is this one: strong relationships. If you don't have strong relationships, if you don't have that kind of safe environment for kids where they feel like they can share and be a part of the classroom and interact, much harder to impact students in learning. There's a saying that it's hard to learn from people that you don't like. And I believe that although you won't always be loved and you won't always love all your kids, that having good relationships can really go a long way towards impacting students. Professional development, the way you seek out opportunities to learn more and gain more. I wish I knew what I know now when I was teaching in the classroom with elementary students. That's not the way the world works, but a lot of professional development, a lot of experience really helps. And then evidence-based teaching. You could see these things are clearly helpful if you're looking at data to make your decisions on the way you're going to teach, what you're going to teach, how you're going to teach it. In terms of the teaching strategies, here are some of the ones that he pointed out. You could see reciprocal teaching, which is you teaching each other. When students teach each other, it's almost the highest level of a teaching method that there is. And reciprocal teaching, you can literally have students teaching the teacher the material, and that's quite a way, that's a very impressive level of understanding that kids get. There's lots of research in that area. Giving kids feedback, appropriate feedback is impacting. Metacognition, which is thinking about thinking. If you can actually analyze the way you think and what ways you learn best, metacognition, another important teaching practice. Spaced practice, when you have kids space their practice out, not try to do things the night before they're due, it really makes a difference in how much retention they have. Teaching problem solving, what an important aspect of learning, and it's one of the most impacting in terms of academic achievement. Note taking and direct instruction, the model we're talking about today, is also super important in one of the top rated strategies. Mastery learning, concept mapping, and worked examples. When you're teaching particularly difficult concepts, when you have a worked example, it is much easier to try to understand the process once you see something that's a positive example. And that's why modeling is so important within the lesson. Here's another look at his work. This is actually a chart where he writes down the effect size of some of these practices. Now here you could see the problem-solving teaching and direct instruction and their effect sizes. They're pretty high up, even though this is misleading because this is only showing, the blue is actually really positive strategies. some of these up here are not actually teaching strategies. They're other things that we do that are not really instructional methods that impact, like classroom management and, microteaching and, development, considering development like Piagetian programs, that sort of thing. A couple of slides I want to show you in his work that are very interesting. Look at some of the differences. Contrary to what people might think, teacher-centered lessons really impact student learning when teachers are driving the lesson and having kids, but being very active as a teacher. Student-centered can flounder a little bit, especially in the hands of an inexpert teacher. So it's not to say that you shouldn't do student-centered approaches or get student interest involved, but when the teacher is very active in the learning, just like in this slide, in this part of the chart, you can see that when the teacher as activator, even versus teacher as facilitator, you can see the gains that kids gain in their academic achievement. Also, in terms of, it makes sense, in terms of teacher-student relations and the impact on student achievement, you can see here that when teachers have good relations with their students, the student behavior improves significantly, can get up a higher effect size than something like this. And it also translates to improved academic achievement, as you can see here, but particularly in student behavior. Those good relationships make a difference in the way kids act in your classroom and the way they learn. And here's some additional research. I'm going to make this Google slide available for you on the Canvas module. And so there's some other links that you can go to see some more work that he has done in this area. Now let's get to the task of unpacking the lesson plan here, lesson design. This is kind of a visual that at a glance can tell you a little bit about the different steps in the lesson plan or components. Some of them are steps, some of them are components. Just a quick visual of that. This is the template, somewhat of a template of what we're going to ask you to use when you're developing your lesson plans. I've got an actual document that has them written out a little bit more specifically. But these are some of the areas you're going to develop: learning outcomes and then behavioral objectives. You're going to have an anticipatory set, a teaching presentation in a typical lesson, which includes modeling, shared practice, and guided practice, and checking for understanding, which actually, it looks like it only occurs here, but CFUs will really need to occur throughout the lesson. We'll talk more about that later. And then closure, some way of summarizing whatever it is that was taught during that teaching act. And then the last part tends to be more like the independent practice. If you give kids some homework where they have to do it on their own, and usually it's connected with assessment, because sometimes that's the only place where you know if kids truly understood the concept that you were teaching, when they actually do it on their own. That way you could really measure whether they learned the concept or not. So in terms of learning outcomes and behavioral objectives, there is a little bit of a difference in education between learning outcomes or goals, like broader goals, and behavioral objectives. Your learning outcomes or goals are going to be a little broader, a little more general in their scope. They're going to be more big picture kinds of things. Behavioral objectives are much more behavior oriented, much more performance oriented. They're more specific. They're tailored right to that specific lesson that you're teaching. Whereas learning outcomes and goals can cover many different lessons, the behavioral objective belongs to that specific lesson. It has to be measurable, achievable, relevant, tangible, time-bound, and so it's behavioral objectives, a little different than learning outcomes. I use what's called Grunlands. As you can see here, this is my lesson plan. You can see that I have in the learning outcome or goal, I have students, a more general, sort of a bigger picture of what I'm hoping for. So in other words, this behavioral objective that I have that's very specific to the lesson plan, in this case, it was given multiple practice opportunities Each student will correctly identify and write a performance objective with 100% accuracy. You can see that this is very specific to this particular lesson plan, whereas this learning outcome or goal is broader and can cover other aspects, perhaps even other lessons that can be done. And so that's why I like Grunland's two-tiered format that allows you to have big picture in mind always, and then specific objectives within your lesson. This UDL piece, let's not look at it for now, although eventually, perhaps this afternoon, you'll also be looking at this, or you might have looked at this yesterday. UDL is something that is going to be really stressed. It's going to be layered into many of the things that we're doing around lesson design. So let me move on here. One thing I want to point out, this objectives part, this learning outcome or goal, the way it's written here does not really take place in front of students. This is for you as a professional to analyze and determine what is going to be your objective to teach that day, using Wiggins and McTeague's concept of backward design, beginning with the end in mind. Where do you want to take kids to is where you start. The actual lesson that begins with kids is in the set. And it's just like the word says, anticipatory set. How are you going to start the lesson? Are you going to have some sort of an engaging hook, something that's interesting? What's the first impression of your lesson? You activate prior knowledge, a quick little video. Maybe it's even the mood that you set for the lesson. If you're teaching the rainforest and the kids come in and there's a fake tree in the center of the room, that paper mache tree, and music that's rainforest music that sets the mood, that could be part of the set. It's the environment that you create, the first impression of the lesson. So it's very, very important. You don't want to start a set with, please turn to page 28. That's not going to be as effective. 4 key components in any set. This is what I will be looking for. We will be looking for in the unit. For the 4 things, one is the hook, where we focus the learner. What kinds of things can you do that hook the learner to something that you want them to be engaged in? So it's that first sort of impression that we do. What's the thing that we do to hook the kids into what they're going to be learning? Another one that's super important is establishing transfer to past learning. Another way of talking about this is activating prior knowledge. What are some things that kids know about this subject that that they know that will connect it to this? And again, super important in being able to do that. There's a lot of research that came out of Harvard on this. When kids have something they know about a subject, and then you continue with that, it's much easier for them. It's like a kind of an intellectual sort of Velcro that they can hang the new knowledge on if they've already had some background in it. One of the areas that we tend to kind of not do when we teach kids is we tell them what they're going to learn, but we don't always tell them why. So establishing the purpose for the lesson is also a very important thing. And we sometimes don't do it. Why is it important that kids learn math? Why do they need to know how to count? How do they need all these things? Well, you should always be talking about those things to students. And then the 4th thing is state the concept. And when you state the concept, in the way that you write the objective in the first component of the lesson plan, it's a little bit more stilted, a little bit more formal. Here, you want to tell the kids the objective in a more student-friendly way. Like, for example, mine says, by the end of this lesson, you'll be able to write a proper performance behavioral objective. And I tend to quote myself here because I want to try to remember the language when I'm going to teach a lesson that I want to use. But here, you're clearly telling the students what's expected of them. What are they going to be learning as the lesson gets started? A next part is very, very important, is what we call the teaching presentation section. Obviously, when you're in the anticipatory set, after you do the anticipatory set, the introduction, you're not going to test the kids. They need a lot more practice opportunities. And this section really gives those children that opportunity to practice. So for example, here in the teaching presentation, the first step is modeling, where I do it and you watch. If you remember in my lesson, I did two modeling steps for the objectives. I had two objectives where I was doing all the talking. I was making my thinking visible. You were observing and trying to absorb what I was saying. And I made a judgment that I needed at least two of them there. Then I also did two shared practices. And in that one, it's I do and you help. So you still have the pen, you're controlling it, but you're drawing the kids in to help you out in understanding the models, the worked examples that you have there. And then the third part is what we call the guided practice, where you kind of hand the pen over to the students here. You do it now, and now I'm going to help you. And a very important step. And when you go through this process, what you're really doing is you're taking them through what we call gradual release. From the teacher kind of controlling things to the students, while you're still monitoring it, you're turning more and more of the learning and the responsibility for learning to them. So this is the way I wrote my lesson plan. Again, I'm not going to read it, but you could take a look at this example on the Canvas when I upload it. It's the modeling that I do, the shared practice I do, you help, and then the guided practice where you do and I help. And if you remember in my lesson, I did two things. The first thing I did for guided practice was that I did the unveiling, the slide reveal, where where we color coded the different components, and you had to figure it out first, and then I would unveil it, and then we would talk about it. And then the other part in the guided practice, I always want to have at least one or two different activities, even though I don't have to always do them both. In this case, I want to do what I asked you to do is put you in groups in those Zoom rooms and breakout rooms, and I asked you to, or in your groups, I asked you to identify the four components by creating an objective out of thin air and identifying those four components. In this environment, obviously, I can't go into the room or into your, I can go into the Zoom room, but I can't go next to you to see how you're doing and use some of these down here, the corrective feedback, praise, prompt, and leave, and gradual release. I really like the praise, prompt, and leave. It allows me to look at the work before it's shared and give the kids a chance to make sure that they correct any errors and save them sometimes from the embarrassment they get from being wrong. So again, very important part of learning right here. Probably in that lesson that I did with you, that's where you probably learned the most impacting part of learning the concept I was teaching about a four component objective. Now, one thing I want to point out here is that all of you guys know there's a famous dance called the sprinkler. And this, when you're teaching a lesson, as you go through these steps, always keep in mind the sprinkler dance. And that is that, the sprinkler moves, right? And then it can go back. So as you're going through your lesson, if you find that kids are struggling with one of the components, let's say you get to guided practice and they're not ready for it, you can always go back. You can go back to the modeling. You can go back to the shared practice. You can always go back and re-explain something or have other examples. Many times we're off target in the way that we diagnose where kids are at. And so this lesson gives you a lot of flexibility to be able to go forward and to go back if necessary. And as you're doing your checking for understanding, you'll know what to do. You don't always just plow ahead. You have to do what's necessary to bring the kids with you as you're teaching. And which brings me to the next step, which is check for understanding. Check for understanding is not really a step. It's a component of the lesson. It really can occur anywhere. I chose to put it here, but really checking for understanding can happen at any point. You're constantly doing checking for understanding, sometimes informally, sometimes formally. Like in this one, turn and talk. Here's an example. Pose a question or a scenario, what if statement to the class. You ask the students to talk to their elbow partner about the question, and you circulate around the room to listen to the discussions. After allowing time to discuss, randomly call on students to share their thoughts. I'm going to stop share for a second here. As I was saying, checking for understanding. Why checking for understanding? If you don't check for understanding, you have, like this expression says, most teaching is spray and pray. A lot of times teachers teach, they spray the information out, and then they pray that the students get it. You know, checking for understanding really allows you to take the pulse of the kids learning and truly whether they're understanding it. In Wiggins and McTeague's book, there's a whole chapter called Understanding Understanding, which is really a pretty deep question. What does it really mean for students to understand? Well, if you don't do checking for understanding, if you don't have a variety of strategies, a variety of techniques, it's really hard to really know whether students are really you know, internalizing the concepts you're teaching. It's kind of like adjusting your car mirrors. You're constantly doing it, looking back, moving it, being on task and on target with what you're doing. This saying by this superintendent, you can't check for understanding if you are sitting down. Wherever I go as a consultant, it seems like 90% of teachers are in the habit of spending too much time sitting during the period. When you're doing direct instruction, you're going to be tired, but it's a good kind of tired. It's a tired that really means you're engaging the students. You've got a lot of activities for them to do. You're monitoring, you're giving them practice opportunities. It's a fast pace and definitely not boring. This is astounding to me. Good and Brophy found that low-level worksheets dominate the school day, something like 50% of instruction time. Now, their findings were, you know, quite a few years back, but I would venture to say that there's still a lot of things that are on handouts. And, you know, it's not that handouts are bad, it's that you do have to be very careful how much of them you use, and the quality of them is important. An important concept in checking for understanding is an acronym we use called TAPPLE to verify that students are learning while you're teaching. TAPPLE stands for teach first, teach first, ask a question, pause, pair, share, and point, pick a non-volunteer, listen to the response, and effective feedback. Teach first. The purpose of CFU is to verify that your students are learning. By teaching before you ask a question, the students are more equipped to respond. So obviously you have to teach something first and before you can check their understanding. Ask a question. During CFU, always ask specific questions about what you're teaching. Don't ask students if they understand the content. If you ever say, do you guys get it? Students are going to say, yeah, we got it, teacher. In reality, their opinion doesn't match their learning many times. You know, back to this one, I want to say something about questioning. Like, one of the things about questioning too is that your kids understand the way you like to ask questions. And asking good questions, putting some thought into it is very important. We're gonna work on something like that later on in the course. So questions, powerful tool if it's used right. In fact, one of the strategies I like best is pause and pair share, because you know, it allows everybody to be engaged because you've got a partner. You know, if you're in a group, sometimes it's easier to hide, but when you've got a partner, you both have to share, and the accountability is there for each of you. One very important concept, Mary Budrow did a lot of research on the idea of wait or think time. It's a very powerful, simple tool that allows all students to stay engaged. What she found in her research is that on average, when a teacher asks a question to students, she waits 1 second, or he waits 1 second before they move on, or they answer their own question. And so kids become conditioned, it becomes the norm that they don't have to engage when the teacher asks a question, because the teacher is usually very impatient. They don't like that silent time. So they'll answer a lot of times their own question. But if your norm changes and becomes, okay, I'm going to wait 5 seconds, then kids look at each other like, oh, teacher's not going away. And if you use something like a wheel decide, which allows you to randomly pick kids out, it gives everybody a chance. Everybody's on the hook, and everybody's expected to know the information. And over time, it really makes a difference for students. For poor achievers, it makes a difference. I've seen research that says up to 300% more that they gain when the teacher expects them to answer by waiting, by having that patience. Again, an important concept, doesn't cost a lot in terms of curriculum, but it's more your attitude towards learning and your expectation of students learning. Good and Brophy found that instruction focused on a small set of students, usually the ones who raise their hands during instruction. Next time you're in a classroom, you just take a look at that, analyze what's happening in a classroom. A lot of times the teacher will only call on those students because they raise their hand, of course, and they know they're going to get probably the right answer, which makes them feel good about themselves, but not necessarily indicative of whether everybody's understanding what's been taught. So the way you deal with this is by picking a non-volunteer. Create the norm that everyone needs to be ready to answer questions at any time. Randomly select 3 non-volunteers. Volunteers make you feel validated by your brightest, but it may not be indicative of the class. And you can do this in a variety of ways. You could do something, let me show you something that you could use. A wheel decide. You put all the kids' names, you click the spinner, and up pops a name that you could use to call on. Very, very powerful here. Yeah, that took me out of my presentation. Let me go back here. Okay, the other thing you have to do in TAPPLE is listen to the response. Listening carefully, determine the level of understanding. Is it correct, partially correct, or just plain wrong? And you want to give effective feedback based on the accuracy of the student's response. You can either echo it. If it's correct, you can affirm it, and it feels good as a teacher when they get it right. You can elaborate if the answer is partially correct, which is still okay, because then you could take their partial answer and add to it and have them delve into it a little deeper. And if 2 students in a row cannot answer, you might have to explain or reteach it or go back it with the sprinkler. I'm just going to run through a few strategies, what we call engagement strategies, to check for understanding. Think, pair, share is classic, one of the most important ones. You should be using these all the time. There's a variation called think, pair, share, and then you add one more, which is square. And in this one, what you do is, let's say if you have a team of 4 kids, you do think, pair, share. So partners think and then pair up and share, and then you square up and get the best thoughts out of those 4 minds once they all talk about their ideas. Think, ink, share. Reflective thinking on a scale of 1 to 5. Another important one is, if you could ask me one question, what would it be? Many times we teach and we just assume they got it, but if they could ask a question about something you just taught, especially if you're using something like Pear Deck where they can actually type in their answers, you'd be amazed at how many questions they truly do have about things you're teaching. 2-minute paper where you summarize the most important points of the lecture, and when they hand the paper in, it becomes an exit ticket as well. My retelling hand. Thumbs up, thumbs down. This one gives you a feel, but not very scientifically will it give you the whether the students really understood it or not. That's something that you need to think about. There's high-tech ways and there's low-tech ways to check for understanding. And this one is definitely more at a glance, not as indicative of, as maybe something else that's more tangible. Light, the traffic lights, when, if they have a little traffic light symbol that says red, I don't get it, I need some help understanding. Yellow is, I think I got it, but let me struggle a little bit. There is such a thing as productive struggle. And then green, I understand and can try this on my own. So these were some of the ones that I used: think, pair, share, 30-cent summary, thumbs up, thumbs down. I used Pear Deck prompts. I asked group questions, I asked individual questions. Individual private responses are good for those kids that are shy and don't want to share out loud. Again, keep in mind the high-tech, low-tech. High-tech works just as well as, low-tech works just as well as high-tech. I like using things like marker boards where kids can write their thoughts down and share them. Hoverboards where you get just a blank piece of paper and put it in a plastic sleeve and they can write it. It serves like, it becomes a little cheap marker board where kids can write their answers when you're teaching them. And then they hover them. When you ask them to share, they just go like that. They can't look at what their buddy answered. And it really gives you a quick feel for whether they're getting the concept or not. And then of course the high tech are like Pear Deck, and the clickers and things like that. Those are all, it's a lot of really high tech ways of, especially these days, of checking for understanding. And then the very end, the closure of a lesson with the students. At some point near the end of a lesson, a systematic closing of the lesson should occur. You shouldn't just let the lesson go away from you. It should be something systematic. It should be something clearly where you're summarizing or recapping the learning that's gone on. I have to share a quick story here. I had a student teacher who was a pretty good teacher, but he was struggling a lot with closure. One of the lessons I observed, it seemed like he planned a good lesson. Kids were involved during all phases, except during the closure, it sort of just disappeared and kids got in line to go to recess. And so I told him, let's focus on your closure for the next time. I want you to do something that's systematic, that it's definitely a closure that kids know, okay, we're going to summarize the lesson with some activities, that sort of thing. Question prompts, think, pair, shares, whatever it is that you're doing for closure. So I'm watching him teach his lesson a week later, and I can see the lesson getting away from him, and I'm worried he's not going to do a closure. So I was mouthing to him from the back of the room, closure, closure. And he sort of panicked. He looked at the kids and he goes, children, this lesson is over. And he yelled at the kids, and the kids just sort of stepped back. Yeah, the lesson was over, but that's not what I meant by closure. You want that closure to be smooth, a smooth landing, like in those airplanes. To me, the scariest part of flying is not flying, it's landing. And in your lesson, you really want it to be a smooth landing, not abrupt, like this picture here. So here were some of the things that I planned for closure for my lesson. I only actually used number 3, the exit ticket. But there are other, describe to your elbow partner. I always overplan in my lessons. Even though I may not use them all, at least I have them there in my lesson plan. That's always a good technique to try to overplan and then not use everything if time doesn't allow or whatever. The kind of the steps that happen sort of apart from the lesson many times. Independent practice is one of those steps that could be in different parts of the lesson. It could actually go right after the guided practice if you feel like the kids can do this on their own, because independent practice is literally you do and I watch. As a teacher, I'm just watching, I'm observing, and maybe even it could be a homework assignment. And in that case, you could write the independent practice after the assessment plan, or you can just leave it there just so that you get the procedure down, but indicate, hey, this is a homework step. The assessment plan is the aspect of the plan. Every lesson should be assessed. You don't always have like really in-depth assessments per se, but you should consider some sort of an assessment anytime that you're teaching the kids. You've got to be able to measure and quantify what happened to an extent. And it could be, maybe you're looking at the process of what they learned or the content of what they learned, how well they learned it based on your criteria, all of those things. So you can see here in my lesson plan what I did my independent practice on. And then the assessment plan, there's 3 key prompts you should include in every lesson plan. Did my students achieve the objective is number 1. Did they achieve the objective? Many times this could be just a yes or no. And number 2, how will I measure what my students accomplished? Are they going to take a quiz? Are they going to do an oral kind of a presentation or review? Are they doing a skit if you're using performance assessment? Are they turning in an exit ticket, survey? How is it that I'm going to measure what they accomplished? Maybe I'm using a KWL chart or a KWHL chart. Number 3, how will I help those students who don't meet the lesson objective? Number 3 is the one that we tend to drop the ball on the most. That is where we really have to figure out what we do with those kids who do not achieve the objective that you have set forth. We do have kids with special needs many times that need a little more time or need some help. Maybe language is a barrier for them. You need to be considering how you're going to help those kids who may not get it just from your magic teaching. They may need some differentiation, some other kinds of interventions. Peer practice, maybe extended practice, remediation, whatever the case may be. So that was the lesson plan in terms of the components. The more you write them, the more you're going to learn how to write them. It's as simple as that. As you design your unit, you're going to be writing a lot of lesson plans. You're going to be getting a lot of feedback. Microteaching is also a lesson plan, so it's all going to help you. So a few summarizing things about this, about direct instruction. Here's some points to consider. You tell them what you're going to tell them with a set. You tell them with a presentation. You demonstrate what you want them to do with modeling. You see if they understand what you've told them with checking for understanding. And you tell them what you've told them by tying it all together with closure. So as you can see, there's lots of practice opportunities. That's one of the strengths of direct instruction. You don't test the kids after the set. You don't test them after the presentation, after you demonstrate, after modeling, after all these things. There's lots of practice opportunities. There's an expression that says there's 2 ways of looking at effective and ineffective teachers. An ineffective teacher will teach like this. Teach, 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 then test. An effective teacher will teach, test, teach, test, teach, test, keep the content pieces smaller, lots of practice opportunities. Other points to consider, it's really about academic tasks. It maximizes their learning because it's focusing on academics. Not a time to talk about your uncle or your favorite aunt. Many practice opportunities under teacher direction. That's why teachers are always tired when they're doing direct instruction well. Effective teachers constantly check for understanding, and they ensure that all students get a chance to respond, either with the wheel decide, popsicle sticks, patterned order, choral responses, signal responses. You want to make sure you hear from all the students. Also gives you a chance to provide corrective feedback. If kids learn things, they could learn them incorrectly, and you might have to reteach it. So it's better to give them corrective feedback when the errors are happening. It's just like learning how to do a layup. If you don't correct kids that are doing it wrong, they're going to learn it the wrong way. So you want to teach them. Perfect practice makes perfect. Academically oriented feedback. It's all about academics. You want to combine feedback with praise, particularly for low achievers. Praise must be genuine and appropriate. Students should move from structured practice to open practice only when they achieve 90% accuracy on the structured practice work. This is really a key part of the whole fully guided instruction approach. As you could see in this model, this part of the lesson of modeling right here, the teacher has all the pen, is doing most of the talking, he's doing the sharing, the thinking aloud. As you share the practice and get to more guided practice, this line decreases, and it's more and more and more on the students. And when they do independent practice, they're completely on their own. It's a very important model to understand of what's happening in this approach to teaching. You want to practice correctly as kids go through this before they move on to independent practice. I could always tell when my children's teachers didn't do a lot of guided practice and modeling, because we ended up doing a lot of teaching at home when they were supposed to be independently doing it at home. Short, intense practice periods produce better learning than longer, extended practice periods. And you want to practice early, and you want to have first few sessions close together so they can retain the information. A couple of more interesting thoughts. Here's a retention during a 40-minute learning episode. You see prime time 1, prime time 2, and downtime is lost. It's times when we fade out and aren't really processing what's being taught. In a 20-minute learning episode, this is greatly addressed in an effective way. If you're only doing 20-minute learning episode, look at your prime time 1 and 2, your downtime is much smaller. This is truly
and
what
now to honor
do.
America and salute the men and women serving our country.
This is truly what good teachers do.
Please welcome, as voted by you, the fans, our winner of the Toyota Get the Feeling of a Star promotion, Natalie Gilbert.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the starlight star? Stars like flags gleaming through such stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight. Oh, the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets gave proof to the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave? For the land of the free and the hope of the brave.
Talk about guided practice, right? What a great teacher. I'm going to stop here. I am going to talk about micro-teaching a little later when we get together on Zoom. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that assignment. I'm going to ask you to start on this assignment, at least do the first part, which has to do with identifying the different lesson components in a video that we have included in that assignment. Mr. Garcia is teaching a lesson to kindergarten students, and we want you to see what he's teaching and how he's teaching it and what are the lesson components of it. You can clearly see the different lesson plan components, so it'll be good practice for you. Then we're going to add something to that assignment when we do the classroom management piece. You'll be able to finalize it, but we're going to have you get started with this part of it. So thanks for listening.